Thank you, Don, and it's great to be here. I want to thank United Waterfowlers for the invitation to present to you today. This is Looe Key Reef. As Don mentioned in the introduction, I've done a lot of work here throughout virtually my entire career at Harbor Branch, going back about 35 years now. And as we think about Everglades restoration and particularly sending more water south, we have to realize that water has impacts on Florida Bay and the Florida Keys. And as I'll show you, this reef, which is about 65 miles south of Shark River, is affected profoundly by discharges that come out of Shark River and are transported down the west side of Florida Bay and through the tidal channels of the Florida Keys. Before we get into the science that I'm going to share with you today over many, many years, what I'd like to do is actually go through some of the history and mentors of the questions that I asked about nutrients and macroalgae and what we're seeing play out today. And I'm glad to hear from Ed that Drew is at the Coral Reef Task Force meeting. We have a real crisis in the Florida Keys. We have very little coral left on those reefs. I can't imagine a Florida Keys without coral, but we're getting very close to that point. We're going to talk a little bit about sewage pollution in the Florida Keys, one of the first things I worked on back in the mid-1980s with Monroe County. And 1990, when we were really at a crossroads in the Florida Keys, with the establishment of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, including a water quality protection program intended to improve water quality, not make it worse. We're going to take a look at what happened with that effort. And that includes really looking at the downstream effects of Everglades restoration and sending water south. And lessons learned from what I'm going to show you today. We're going to look at the CROGE report, the Committee on Restoration of the Greater Everglades Ecosystem, done through the National Research Council and National Academies of Science. And I'm going to close with a video that I produced for the Florida Chamber of Commerce on what's happening right now in the Florida Keys with the wastewater issues and the septic to sewer program, about a $1 billion program that is really leading to amazing improvements of water quality in the inshore waters. Well, you know, with my students, I really like to go back to the history of the issues of the coral reefs of the Florida Keys. And the first scientific study was really carried out by Louis Agassiz from Harvard University in the 1850s. Who was commissioned by the Coastal Survey at that time, the predecessor of NOAA, to go to the Keys and see what could be done about getting rid of the coral. At that time, the mid-1800s, the wrecking era in Key West, these coral reefs were a hazard to shipping. It was a real problem. So if you read this, this is his reply after 2 years of survey work and research in the Florida Keys, all the way out to the Dry Tortugas. He didn't see the possibility of, in any way, of limiting the extraordinary increase of corals beyond the bounds which nature itself has assigned to their growth. You're going to see the irony of that statement today. Along the way, growing up in West Palm Beach in the 1960s, I read a lot in the Palm Beach Post about the amazing work of Art Marshall, then director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife facility up in Vero Beach, Florida. And it was fascinating to me, and it was definitely something that was one of those early experiences that led me into the research that I do today. Learning about the work, Lake Okeechobee, the Kissimmee River project that was being done at that time. And what impressed me most about Art, and which created a great curiosity in me, was his recognition, because we were so focused on water quantity at that time, that water quality is a far graver problem in the long run than is water quantity. And we're going to see Art's vision way back, how that is playing out today. Another very important mentor of mine that, again, was very important in my thinking was Dr. John Ryther. I worked with John at Woods Hole Oceanographic after I graduated from BU in 1973. John is the guy that made Woods Hole famous in my book. He is the scientist who first showed that while phosphorus is the limiting nutrient in freshwater systems generally, it was nitrogen that controlled algal blooms in the marine environment. And his early work was done in Long Island, where he showed runoff from duck farms was causing algal blooms that were impacting the shellfish industry there. Today, those duck farms are gone, but they've been replaced by high-density residential areas with septic tanks that local scientists are showing is a major nitrogen source to the brown tides that are leading to the loss of seagrass in that system. John, when he retired from Woods Hole in the early 1980s, I had just finished my PhD, and we worked together actually at Harbor Branch, looking at kind of biofuels, recycling human wastewater for the production of fast-growing seaweeds, algae. We actually were growing this red drift seaweed gracilaria. This is the plant that overgrew parts of Tampa Bay due to the sewage discharges in the 60s and 70s. It's very abundant in the Indian River Lagoon system, where it's being fed by a number of nutrient sources, including wastewater. So we did a lot of work with that, and of course we've seen a lot happen since that work was done with the expansion of these macroalgae blooms around Florida. So what I'm going to be talking about today a lot is nitrogen rather than phosphorus so much, but it's not just the concentration of nitrogen or phosphorus, but really the ratio of the two that you're going to see is very important to what's happening and understanding the science of the impact we're having on coral reefs of the Florida Keys. This is just a little diagram of the nitrogen cycle, and it was really a game changer when over a century ago we developed a technology to take inert nitrogen from the atmosphere and produce fertilizer to grow the world population. In essence, half the people on the planet today, half their nitrogen in their body was made in a factory, okay? This was a game changer. This is how we've grown the world population. The fertilizer runoff we're seeing affecting our waters, as well as the wastewater from this growing population, really emanates from this technological advance, to the point where today we have way over twofold the amount of reactive nitrogen on our planet that we once did. 120 million metric tons per year that we can make from inert nitrogen in the atmosphere. But we're only releasing 9 million metric tons of mined phosphorus from phosphate mining. So when you look at the ratio of how we're adding nutrients to our planet, the ratio is going up. And that ratio right there, those two numbers, is a ratio of about 30 to 1. Now the so-called Redfield ratio of balanced growth for algae is about 16 to 1. So what we're doing, we're driving these systems with more nitrogen than phosphorus, causing imbalance. And we're going to see how that's affecting corals in the Florida Keys. I was really honored back in the year 2000 to be invited by the National Academy to be a co-author in this book, Clean Coastal Waters, Understanding and Reducing the Effects of Nutrient Pollution. And it's a great policy text. I helped write the section on effects of nutrients on coral reefs based on my work both from the Florida Keys and around the Caribbean. But we recognize then that the fundamental problem here is the accumulation of nitrogen and phosphorus in fresh water that is being delivered to our estuaries and coastal oceans. And along the way, I've also been involved in developing the national agenda for the study and mitigation of harmful algal blooms that are resulting from these increased nutrient loads to our estuaries and coastal waters. The first attempt was the EcoHab program between 1994 and 2004. This is the last national program, the Harness program. And harmful algal blooms, the way we define them, they're both phytoplankton, single-celled algae, and macroalgae, the larger seaweeds, that can cause harm by direct toxicity, like red tides, or indirectly by excessive biomass, such as the brown tides we're having in the Indian River Lagoon. They could be toxic, we don't know for sure. We need more research on that. But what they do that we know is shade the seagrasses, and that's leading to the loss of seagrasses in the Indian River Lagoon. The same thing happens with high biomass blooms of macroalgae. They can overgrow seagrass beds, they can overgrow coral reefs when nutrients get too high. And ultimately, this biomass consumes oxygen and creates dead zones, okay? And the dead zones are on the increase all around our country. This is some of the earliest work we did in the Florida Keys. It's a photo of John Ryther and I in Pine Channel, just off Big Pine Key. This is back in the early 1980s. Again, we were doing field dosing studies with nitrogen and phosphorus, looking at how those nutrients control algal growth. Again, for their potential for biofuels production. And in the winter, in the dry season, we found that both nitrogen and phosphorus regulated the growth, but in the summer, only phosphorus. And what we noticed is that in the water, the nitrogen was going up, which eliminated nitrogen as a limiting nutrient to the growth of that plant. And we realized that we really should start a monitoring program to really carefully track the nutrient concentrations, because the Florida Keys, like the Everglades, those coral reefs are oligotrophic ecosystems, just like the Everglades. You add nutrients, you gum things up. And so we decided the place to do this would be Lapointe Reef, about 4 miles south of Big Pine Key, where we set up a long-term transect for collecting water and analyzing on this autoanalyzer at Harbor Branch for low-level concentrations of ammonium, nitrate, and phosphate. So we began that in 1984. And what we noticed, though, during that first study with the high nitrogen in the summer, we began to think, well, what are the sources? Where's this nitrogen coming from? And of course, the most proximal source at the time, you didn't have to look very far, were the high-density subdivisions around the Florida Keys, like this one, where you have canals and high densities of homes, residences with septic tanks. And this, of course, is the worst-case scenario where there really isn't soil like we have in other parts of Florida. This is limestone. There's no organic carbon in that to get any kind of denitrification, for example. And we have very fast flow through of effluent. It literally can flow like a pipe. And we measured those groundwater flows with this groundwater flow meter built in Woods Hole. We showed, for example, in this study that was published in the journal Biogeochemistry in 1990, that rain events, when the rain falls in the Florida Keys, it causes a rapid lateral movement of these contaminated septic plumes into the canals and the near shore water. And this is what this graph shows here. But we also showed 24/7 that the tides coming and going were causing what we refer to as tidal pumping. During ebbing tides, we saw a surge in the movement of the groundwater down gradient into the marine environment. And we also saw reversals during high tides. As the tide was flooding, that flow would actually slow down and in some cases even reverse itself. So what I've seen over my 35 years in the Florida Keys is the greening of the water. Not unlike we've seen in many of the spring sheds and springs in North Florida and other parts of Florida. This is a picture of me at the Content Keys, just near Big Pine Key in 1989. That water in the 80s were the last years we had really what we could call gin clear water. 1989, same year, this is Florida Bay. Look how green the water is behind me, and the macroalgae that was forming thick blooms in Florida Bay. This particular red alga, Laurencia, was the second most abundant plant in Florida Bay next to turtle grass back in those years. If we fast forward to 2008, this is the rock pile reef near the Content Keys. That's a bloom of Cladophora, a stringy green alga that is a clear indicator of excess nutrients in the water. And just 2015, these are both from hard bottom and reef habitats on the south side of Big Pine Key. These are red algae, Asparagopsis here. This is overgrowing some dead coral patch reefs right near Little Palm Island. And this is a plant that's very abundant up in St. Lucie County on the worm reefs, Indian River County, Brevard County. This was never in the Florida Keys in any conspicuous amount, but it is now. It's forming major blooms, overgrowing these dead coral reefs and some living coral reefs. And this is a plant that just appeared this summer. This is Bryothamnion. Again, we haven't seen that. These are growing along Hawk Channel that are receiving a lot of water coming out of Florida Bay, okay? So what we saw happening in the Florida Keys was not really that unique to the Florida Keys. We're seeing problems like this around the Caribbean and the world. Coral reefs in many ways are the canary in the coal mine. And I began really looking at the role of nutrients in driving this, what we call phase shift from coral-dominated systems that we once had in the Florida Keys towards algal-dominated systems. Either these little turf algae that's like a mustache, little filamentous algae, or the bigger seaweeds, the frondose macroalgae, or the coralline algae, these kind of hard calcified corals that also grow in coral reefs. I did a lot of this work with my colleagues, Mark and Diane Littler from the Smithsonian Institution. Did a lot of this work out of the Belize, down on the Belize Barrier Reef at Caribou Key. And this is the trajectory of coral decline in the Caribbean region. We can see that back in the 1977 period, we had upwards of about 60% cover on these reefs of living coral. And you can see the decline over time. Right now, the Florida Keys has the lowest amount of coral cover of any reefs in the Caribbean. We are kind of an outlier, even though they're all on this trajectory. And a number of people who have been studying reefs, of course, invoke the die-off of the sea urchin, Diadema. Some of you may be familiar with the black long-spined sea urchin, which occurred in the early 1980s. And that's when we did see more fleshy algae overgrowing these coral reefs, but look at what happened. The reefs had already declined tremendously from the 1970s into the 80s, and algae was actually expanding during this time. So we believe what we're really witnessing here is the eutrophication of these coastal reefs as they got more nutrients from fertilizers, wastewater, atmospheric deposition, that these nutrients produced more algae that actually led to these population booms that we saw in many of these sea urchins. This is what they do. With increased food resources, they will expand their populations up to a point where they died. And they did die mysteriously. No one really knows the cause, but they are coming back around the Caribbean. But the urchins aren't the only things that eat algae on the reefs. We have herbivorous fishes such as surgeonfish and parrotfish that are quite abundant. We don't target these fish species in our fisheries in the Florida Keys. They do in other parts of the Caribbean where that is an issue. So if you go to the Keys today, you will see abundant population of these grazers, and they do a pretty good job where they're in high abundance, places like Looe Key. So the question for me became, what is the concentration of nitrogen that triggers the phase shift from coral-dominated ecosystems to algal-dominated systems? This is the question that was asked in the Everglades, where cattails were overrunning the natural vegetation. And so some of these are my studies, some are others, different species of macroalgae that were grown in very controlled conditions, what we call steady state conditions and chemostats, where we could control the nutrient concentration. And this is the relative growth rate of these big, large seaweeds. You can see with increasing nitrogen, this is dissolved inorganic nitrogen, going from 0 to 1 micromolar is the unit I'm using here, but that 1 micromolar is 14 parts per million. Now you heard Ed, what are we shooting for in the Everglades? 10 parts per billion, of phosphorus, the limiting nutrient in the Everglades. So what we see here is that we have a very similar situation on coral reefs, and they're oligotrophic systems. You add nutrients at low concentrations, and here we go, 14 parts per billion, this growth curve becomes saturated. And if you look carefully, it actually saturates at about half of that, around 0.5, which would be 7 parts per billion. So that's the range which essentially encompasses the same range that we see problems develop in the Everglades with phosphorus. Okay? That just shows how these marine ecosystems that have evolved over millions of years are highly sensitive to low-level increases. And when we look at coral reefs that are still healthy, like on the very outer Great Barrier Reef in Australia, those concentrations are down very low, about 0.1 micromolar, or just a couple parts per billion of reactive nitrogen. So once we realized the sensitivity of these coral reefs to nitrogen, we began looking, and this work was funded by the MacArthur Foundation around 1990. We began looking at concentrations of ammonia, nitrate with distance from shore in the Florida Keys. And we saw very clearly that in these nearshore waters, we had very high concentrations of ammonia and nitrate. This is that 1 micromolar or 14 ppm threshold right here. And you can see the inshore were way over there. And if you add the nitrate and the ammonium together to get all the reactive nitrogen, we were basically right there at that threshold, all the way out to our outer reefs in the Keys, which explains why we were seeing problems of coral diseases. And as you're going to see, coral bleaching and other problems that we were seeing in the 80s, but especially in the 90s, right after this study was done. This is phosphorus down here. Again, we see some high concentrations in the nearshore waters. And we also see this is dissolved oxygen. We see this oxygen sag, again, in these nearshore waters where we had a lot of wastewater from septic tanks and package plants, getting the effects of BOD and algal blooms drawing down the oxygen. We also looked at the effects of these increasing nutrient concentrations on seagrass health, and showed really for the first time in that region that these epiphytes that we see, this is some turtle grass, you can see with increasing nutrients you get that algal scum or slime we call epiphytes overgrowing those blades, reduces the light to the seagrasses, and ultimately can lead to die-off of those seagrasses. And at some point, macroalgae, the larger seaweeds, come in as well with the elevated nutrients. Dr. David Tomasco, some of you may know, did a postdoc with me in those years, and really was a great collaborator, and he has gone on to do some really great work. So we knew we had a problem with sewage in the Florida Keys. You know, by the late 80s, articles like this were in the newspaper. And we, of course, know more about that. We've seen impacts in other areas of Florida. The pink and red areas are septic tanks all around Florida. We have a higher reliance on septic tanks than pretty much any state in the United States. And places like Wakulla Springs, where there have been a lot of studies done on this in the spring sheds. What we used to think septic tanks were a relatively small part of the nitrogen budget affecting these springs, 5%, 10%. It's up there around 50% for Wakulla Springs, and this is also the case in other springs like Silver Springs. It's around 40%. So we're learning a lot more about how nitrogen from septic tanks, they're not designed to remove nitrogen, are affecting groundwaters and surface waters. So by 1990, the situation was really getting quite serious in the Florida Keys and the Everglades as well. This was the special issue of Nat Geo that I was asked as a scientific reviewer to review the article by Fred Ward on the imperiled coral reefs of the Florida Keys. And this was my quote, that nutrient pollution is pushing Florida's reefs beyond their ability to survive. Cleaning up the sewage in the Florida Keys would be a major step in the right direction, and agricultural pollution should be kept away from the Keys reefs. And so following that was the establishment of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. That act passed in 1990. Everyone was in agreement that water quality was the 900-pound gorilla in the room that had to be dealt with. And this is the first national marine sanctuary to have a water quality protection program that brought the US EPA in together with NOAA and DEP to formulate a plan for moving this plan ahead. And this is the water quality protection program phase 1 document right here, put together by Continental Shelf Associates in 1991. And if you look at that, as I did right when it came off the press, I was pretty disturbed because this particular comment, and it was cited as a reference to Ron Jones, who was at FIU, a scientist there at the time, that in carbonate environments, the limiting nutrient is primarily phosphorus. Well, we knew at that time nitrogen was very important, but if you look at the timing, of course, this was very much Everglades lawsuit centric. It was focused on phosphorus. And so all of a sudden we're saying, well, they're not recognizing nitrogen as an issue in Florida Bay or the Florida Keys. They're focusing on phosphorus. Another thing that caused a little bit of heartburn was the claim in this document that salinities of 55 parts per thousand can be fatal to seagrasses, because we were seeing seagrass die off in Florida Bay at this time, starting in 1987. But we knew from studies done in Laguna Madre, Texas, and other parts of the world that these are salt-tolerant plants, okay? And furthermore, a lot of the seagrass die-off we were seeing was in western part of Florida Bay, okay? Not in central or eastern Florida Bay. So there was a lot of concern there also, okay, that they weren't getting the science right in this water quality protection program. And today, of course, we know from the work of Marguerite Cook at FAU, one of my colleagues, who actually experimentally showed that salinities as high as 70 parts per thousand, they couldn't really kill total seagrass shoot growth at salinities of 70 parts per thousand for 30 days, okay? Again, we knew this, these were very salt-tolerant plants. And in that paper, they conclude that turtle grass and haliduli, the Cuban shoalweed, are highly tolerant of high salinity. Again, we knew this. And that hypersalinity in Florida Bay, which so many people are focused on, really cannot solely explain the seagrass die-off that we're seeing across Florida Bay. So this is what some of the newspaper headlines looked like back in the early 90s as this water quality protection program started moving forward. We see this Keys crisis here. This is August of 1992. And here's the dead zone. What you're going to see is that water was being sent south in 1991 and 1992. We had a pretty severe drought, 1989, 1990. And the claim was made that these high salinities were killing the seagrasses. So more water is coming in and actually causing algal blooms in the central and western bay. And that's what we're looking at in this diagram here, so-called dead zone. But what's interesting, even though water is coming in, salinities are going down, the messaging to the public is that most scientists blame a shortage of fresh water that once flowed from the Everglades on the dead zone, and it was actually totally the opposite. The blooms were related to water and nitrogen coming in to the bay. Mostly from Shark River, as Ernie pointed out, that's where the bulk of the water is coming. It was affecting the west side of Florida Bay, but mostly affecting the middle and lower Florida Keys. And I wanted to share with you, this is just some footage from one of the Sanctuary Advisory Council meetings.
We're very privileged. I'll introduce this speaker here in a few minutes, but we're going to hear from a special speaker here for an hour. And then we're going to hear from the Comp Coalition. And I called Michelle Wells and said, we wanted to hear from you. We're concerned about your concerns. It's going to be her program. That's going to last an hour. And then the council is going to talk among itself in response to that presentation.
And I'll start this off by saying that there are some severe water quality problems here. What was first bandied about so much in the press is not where the real serious problems lie. What garnered a lot of attention early on relating to water quality issues of the Keys and the coral reefs was what was nothing more really than a hypothesis of some people that nutrient pollutants from your septic tanks were leaching out, getting into the surrounding waters, and then making their ways out to the reef, and this was what was causing the algal bloom on coral reefs and was starting to kill the coral reefs. So pollution from the Keys was impacting the reefs heavily. As time has gone on, and a lot of it was because this was information that was poorly filtered, it wasn't looked at really carefully, and it sort of quickly took on a life of its own. A lot of agencies who wanted to control things here in some ways started producing white papers that supported this view and so on. But in fact, it's something that was never proven and has at best always been an allegation. We do know some things about the region and some things about the climate. Part of the natural, normal, everyday climate of this system here is hurricanes. These ecosystems, the seagrasses and the mangroves, evolved with that stress as a part of their natural background. And it's now been 26 and a half years since the last real hurricane. Now that is nearly 4 times the normal interval. During the time we're approaching the wet season, the very water that's needed, they let run off out canals and flush away, so they'll have a storage area. Instead of building bigger levees to retain the natural water that flows, they let the water flow out so that when a storm occurs, they've got some place to store it. And so the management in there, in my opinion, my own private, humble opinion, I think one of the things that needs to be done is a change in the goals for water management for this whole region. We've got to get we can't ignore, obviously, I'm not being so stupid enough as to propose we forget about, stormwater management and let people drown or anything like that. But the priorities have to be shifted so that the natural system starts getting more of its fair share of water and gets it when it needs it. And that's the key.
My name is David Paul Loran. I'm a private attorney here in Key West down there. I'm not being paid for this. I'm doing it because it's what I believe. And that's why I'm us want to waste our time because it's the only thing that we spend and we can't ever replace it. Collectively, the members of this council have already spent hundreds of hours, and the members of the public, many of whom are out here, have already spent thousands of hours collectively involved in the sanctuary process. Now, all of these hours are spent under the assumption that our efforts can and will make a difference in what happens.
And I'm here to do something about the habitat and water quality problem and put together a plan where you people come together and say, by golly, this is a good, sensible plan and we can live with it, and let's try to make it work. And that's what everybody here is about.
Well, Mr. Farley, let me comment one thing. The worst mistake anybody could ever make is to be a federal employee and look at somebody and grin and say, trust me, I'm from the government.
So those words are truer today than they were back then. So what we saw there was, Jay Zeman saying that, this idea that sewage and septic tanks are a problem wasn't properly reviewed and vetted in these white papers, when in fact, I had previously shown you 2 peer-reviewed scientific papers, one in biogeochemistry, another one in the Journal of Experimental Marine Biology and Ecology, documenting the problems of septic tanks in the nearshore environment in the Florida Keys. So obviously there was a trust problem in the Florida Keys with the Marine Sanctuary Program. Started, at this point, if not earlier. The commercial fishermen, the treasure salvors just didn't trust that the federal government was going to do the right thing. And actually culminated in a vote in 1996, a non-binding referendum where a majority of residents in Monroe County gave a thumbs down, a lack of confidence in NOAA to do the right thing. And these are just some of the headlines that came out. Again, everyone knew there was a water quality problem. We saw the water turning greener, more turbid, problems on the corals. Yet this ecologist finds no marine water quality problem and attributes the issues just to a lack of hurricanes, and we've had some pretty major hurricanes in the Florida Keys since, and they've really done nothing to help this problem. And send the water south. That's really all we need to do, is put more water into Florida Bay in the Florida Keys region. And this was also kind of taken to the next step by Jim Porter, who was working on monitoring the corals, but he framed it in a different way. Jim said, well, this freshwater flow is a hypothesis, and it's the best one we have right now to explain what we're seeing. So this became the mantra and the mainstream thinking, even though there was no science to support the idea that high salinity was killing the seagrasses and resulting in these algal blooms. But we saw a lot of headlines like this, super salty water destroying Florida Bay in one of the local papers, where this hypersalinity is coincidental with Florida Bay's decline. Science would call this coincidence a strong indication of a cause-effect relationship. Florida Bay has been hypersaline for many, many, many decades. Some of the highest salinities were in the 1950s when the turtle grass looked great and the water was very clear. The seagrasses were actually growing very well, and that was very well documented. So there has not been any significant change over time in salinity. A number of studies have shown that. On the other hand, we see increasingly the effects of water releases, particularly these extreme rain events from the Caloosahatchee, from Shark River. We're now monitoring these with satellite remote sensing. And we've got a chance to actually look very carefully at the nutrients coming out with these discharges and how they're affecting the Florida Bay, Florida Keys region. I'm going to just quickly go through some data from Shark River Gulf, the Mid-Cape, Florida Bay Ledge, the rock pile here, and the Lukey Reef. We've done drifter studies where we've released drifters at Shark River, and you can see repeatedly these come right down into the back country of the Keys. This one actually circumnavigated the Keys. So we know that water is coming down and influencing the Florida Keys region. This is the Naval Coastal Ocean Model, showing these vectors, showing the long-term net flow of water from Shark River, again coming down all the way down towards the Florida Bay Ledge, coming under the 7 Mile Bridge, and then going west in Hawk Channel, ultimately affecting Looe Key. Also the rock pile, that reef to the north of Big Pine Key. So with funding from NASA, we got to actually go out and collect water samples and do some remote sensing studies. This is just 2 years of data, 2010, 2012. This is the reactive nitrogen. I've got the 1 micromolar dashed line on here, and you can see 2010, still a relatively dry year following that prolonged drought we had. We didn't see really high concentrations coming out of Shark River, but look at 2011. When we came out of that drought, we had pretty high concentrations of reactive nitrogen. And you can see these extend all the way downstream to Looe Key, where again, both years we are over that 1 micromolar threshold. But as I mentioned earlier, it's not just the nutrient concentration, it's the ratio. This is the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus in this plot. And again, 2010, 2011. Look at the spike in the wet year of the N to P ratio, more nitrogen than phosphorus coming out of the Everglades. And we know the Everglades is a great filter for phosphorus, but not so much for nitrogen. So here's Looe Key, again downstream of these flows. And this is one of our early satellite images showing the increased flows in the early 90s in response to the calls for more water by George Barley and the Sanctuary Advisory Committee. Increased waters came down beginning in 1991 and really extended into 1995, which was a very, very wet year. And this is just showing the discolored water, the algal bloom, and what you saw earlier to be the dead zone, okay? This discolored turbid water on the west side of Florida Bay. It's not coming into Florida Bay, but it's moving towards Long Key, the Channel 5 bridge. And we can see by 1996, that turbidity over many years of increased flows of water, and the salinity was dropping quite dramatically in Florida Bay. That turbidity and algal bloom you can see from Shark River extended all the way beyond the Marquesas Keys, actually went all the way out to the Tortugas, and you can see it coming streaming through the tidal channels. You can also see over here in the Teller Slough area, again, there's a lot of nitrogen, other contaminants in that water coming down from South Dade County, and you can see that effect over on the eastern bay as well. So this is just what started happening to the water. It got greener and more turbid in the early 90s. This is Cape Sable. You can see that discolored water moving towards the western bay. This is the park boat, the Bald Eagle. In the western bay, you can see that turbidity. It's hard to grow seagrasses when there's that much turbidity and chlorophyll A in the water. Here you see this bloom. This is Senecacoccus, a blue-green algal bloom, very similar to what some of the blue-green algae we're seeing in the Indian River Lagoon. And here's a diver offshore Key West. You can see how green that water got, the chlorophyll content of that water. And it was about this time I ran into a colleague, Dr. Charlie Jensch, an optical oceanographer who worked with NASA developing a lot of the ocean color remote sensing techniques that we use today. And we published a paper together showing the problems of reducing light to corals. Corals need a lot of light. Their photosynthesis respiration ratio is very close to 1. So this turbidity and chlorophyll A in the water is not good for the corals. And so this is the timeline showing our long-term monitoring for reactive nitrogen from 1984 to 2014. 3 decades of data at Looe Key, the longest long-term low-level nutrient record for a coral reef anywhere in the world. There's the 1 micromolar line. You can see in the 80s, we were still down there hovering right around 0.5 or 7 parts per billion. But with the increased water, sending that water south in the early 90s, okay, right after the establishment of the sanctuary, look at the spike in reactive nitrogen that we experienced downstream. We saw this in Florida Bay as well. It wasn't just the reefs. It was coming down, being carried by the currents downstream. And we can see that the flows, the blue lines are the flows, the green is the reactive nitrogen. And we can see that by 1997, how those flows diminished. This was where the time period when the Cape Sable seaside sparrow came in to protection. And those flows then began going more to the east and the west from Lake Okeechobee. But the point is, you can see that as time has gone on, even though the flows have diminished coming down from Shark River, we can see that the nitrogen has not returned to the level it was at in the 1980s. So it's kind of like the nitrogen is loaded into the system. This is building up as legacy nitrogen in the system today. This is just an aerial photograph showing the water coming through the 7 Mile Bridge. You can see this brownish color, which we refer to as CDOM, or colored dissolved organic matter. And this is what the headlines looked like back again in '92 as this water was being sent south. Algal blooms expanding out of Florida Bay. This is kind of some of that algae. This is a brown alga dictyota. We saw the effects with hydrolabs that Monroe County had funded us to actually look at the oxygen concentrations in and around Looe Key and some of the inshore areas. And we saw using these instruments, continuous recording, salinity and oxygen, how rain events in these canals in the inshore where you have all these high density septic tanks cause anoxia. And any of you who've been to the Keys, you can smell that, okay, that hydrogen sulfide smell. That's what's doing it. And even out at Looe Key offshore, after these storm events and the water coming south, we began to see oxygen fall below 3 parts per million, get actually even under 2 parts per million of oxygen on coral reef communities. And that is falling into the definition of a dead zone. And that today is being recognized more broadly, that we're having these problems with dead zones on coral reefs around the world. We also looked at the macroalgae blooms that we were seeing using stable nitrogen isotopes. And we found that, for example, in the dry season, going all the way from Looe Key on this end to the Content Keys in Florida Bay side of the lower Keys, during the dry season, when you don't get a lot of flow or very little flow coming out of the Everglades, these values are matching up with wastewater nitrogen, values of about 5 to 6 parts per mil. But that summer, when we began to get rain and water coming out of the Everglades, we began to see those values fall in the algae to lower values of 3 and lower, more indicative of atmospheric nitrogen, fertilizers, topsoil, a number of other nitrogen sources with lower isotopic values, including offshore upwelling of deep water nitrate that you can have periodically in these systems. So this is the chlorophyll A. You just saw the reactive nitrogen, significant increase in nitrogen since 1990, since the sanctuary was formed. This is the chlorophyll A response, the algal response in the water column of Looe Key. And again, just like the reactive nitrogen, highly significant increase since the 1980s. But beyond that, this is what's so interesting. The flow, we've got chlorophyll A at Looe Key versus flow coming out of Shark River. A significant correlation between the discharge of the flow of Shark River and the chlorophyll A content at Looe Key. Again, 65 miles downstream. But this is, of course, what we've known. Those of us that study coral reefs are very aware of the importance of river discharges to water quality and their effects on the long-term health of coral reefs. When we looked at this further in 1996, again, we had a lot of green water around. We looked at 3 sites, one, Avenue J in Spanish Harbor Channel in Big Pine Key, which was adjacent to over 1,000 septic tanks. Patch Reef off Big Pine, and then Lou Key Reef 4 miles offshore. You can see these very high chlorophyll A values in the summer were a result of rainfall pushing wastewater out into the channel from the septic tanks, okay? So you could clearly see that in the inshore. The offshore, out at Lou Key that year, we had very high chlorophyll A concentrations, about 0.6 micrograms per liter. It should be down like 0.1 or less. So this was clearly a situation that was it's very harmful to the health of the seagrasses in corals, both inshore and offshore. And one other thing, this particular study was published in the Journal of Experimental Marine Biology and Ecology in 2004. But it was actually based on a report I did for the Water Quality Protection Program back in 1996. And so by the time we actually did that study in 96, we knew we couldn't solve this water quality problem just by cleaning up the wastewater in the Keys. And we have to look beyond the Keys, upstream to the Everglades. And this is the quote: "It's unlikely that corrective actions for controlling wastewater nutrient loads in the Florida Keys will by itself be adequate to fully restore water quality over the large regional scale of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. Larger scale control of nutrient loads from the South Florida watershed will be needed if the trend of eutrophication in Florida Bay and the Florida Keys is to be reversed." So other types of problems we saw as that water came south: the largest red tide that we have seen in the Florida Keys historically in 1995. Again, not just more as a result of more deliveries of water, but a very extreme wet year in 1995. You can just see the headlines here about the impacts of the red tide, and this interesting one by Mark Caputo that the Bay remedy of sending the water south could be backfiring. And let's see, by 1997, as I mentioned earlier, the response of sea urchins to nutrients, we saw a boom of sea urchins in Florida Bay that was about a 4-mile long marching front of urchins that were just grazing down the seagrasses. And there was a big concern of the commercial fishermen that were out there. There was a lot of question as to whether the resource managers should come out and intervene and remove the urchins. They never did. It was disrupted actually by Hurricane Georges in 1998. So this is where the science gets very interesting regarding the imbalance of nitrogen and phosphorus. This is a paper that recently came out, and we've known this for some time, but this really provided a really great sophisticated mechanism for how that high N to P ratio, as nitrogen goes up and phosphorus doesn't, stresses the symbiosis of the coral. Corals have adapted to nutrient limitation, low nutrients, whereby the zooxanthellae, the symbiotic algae, recycle nutrients from the animal, and in exchange they give the animal sugars. This is a symbiosis that's evolved over many years. When the nutrients go up in the water, particularly nitrogen without phosphorus, this leads to a situation of high nitrogen, low phosphorus that basically, in simplest terms, undermines the integrity of the photosynthetic membranes, the thylakoid membranes in the zooxanthellae, and it basically effectively reduces the temperature threshold for coral bleaching. And I'm sure you've seen this with the problems we're having globally now with coral bleaching. So what this means is that as we pollute our coastal waters more with nitrogen from multiple sources, we're sensitizing corals to elevated temperatures. So where these corals would normally bleach at, say, 34 degrees or 35, now they're bleaching at 31 or 32 degrees. And so when we look at Lou Key, at the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio over 3 decades, what do we see? The 3 mass bleaching events all occurred following spikes in the N to P ratio, okay? The first one, 1987, second one, 1997, and the more recent one in 2014 and 2015, we had another bleaching. And all these followed either extreme wet years like El Nino years, 1983. The big one here, of course, we were getting more deliveries to Florida Bay, but we also had the extremely wet year of 1995. And in 2013, we had a lot of water come into Florida Bay from the Taylor Slough area, and I'll show an image of that in a minute. So we think the N to P ratio is a key part of the story of what's happening to the corals. We didn't get to measure the N to P in the coral tissue itself. This is the N to P ratio of the macroalgae at Lou Key, going up significantly from the 1980s to the 1990s and beyond, okay? So this is, again, how we are altering the ecological stoichiometry of nitrogen and phosphorus on our planet. You've heard a lot about the role of temperature in inducing bleaching, and certainly temperature is a factor. But this is temperature at Lou Key from 1984 to 2014. These are the 3 major bleaching events. And you can see this is the threshold for bleaching that's been proposed. You can see we've had many years over that bleaching threshold, but the only mass bleaching events occurred when we had those high N to P ratios that poised those corals for that stress. This is the long-term temperature record going back to 1875, about the time, of course, Louis Agassiz was down in the Keys, to 2015. And you can see there's a lot of variability in the data. A lot of these temperature values are over that threshold, and we only recently saw bleaching in the recent years. And so clearly something else is going on with that bleaching mechanism. We've also had problems with coral diseases. They increased after the water was sent south in the 90s as well, 250% increase. Black band disease, aspergillosis, yellow band disease, this is whitepox disease. And whitepox is caused by a fecal coliform bacterium. We know where that comes from. It wasn't just affecting the corals, the beaches were getting shut down as well, all the way out to the Tortugas, with more water coming in, again, to Florida Bay. We had a lot of sewage in the Florida Keys, inadequately treated sewage that was basically feeding on the organic matter from the algal blooms that we were seeing. So the hiccups were all joining together. This was a real economic crisis for the Keys in the 90s, and it affected the beaches all the way out to the Tortugas. And this is the coral decline, which was really a regional extinction of elkhorn coral. This is from eastern dry rocks off Key West. Again, following those algal blooms in Florida Bay in the early 90s. You can see this is what pretty much happened Keys-wide. This is the little fecal coliform bacterium. And you can see from 1994 forward how that living coral tissue receded through 1998 to virtually low levels, non-existent levels in this quadrant by the year 2000. So I want to just share this video with you very briefly, just showing you over time the change in the community at Lou Key.
Which one is it? Lou Key before and after?
Yeah, yeah. So this is Lou Key. In the 80s, I mentioned this is kind of the last years of really good water quality that we had in the Keys. You can see we still had considerable amounts of elkhorn coral on the Fore Reef at Lou Key, providing a lot of habitat for fisheries. You can see the schools of fish, including copper sweepers, that you rarely see anymore on any of the reefs in the Keys, right there. And this was Lou Key by the year 2000, okay, after, again, this major effort to send water south to Florida Bay and the expanding algal blooms coming out of the bay affecting the reefs. And this isn't a result of overfishing of herbivorous fish. We have a lot of large-bodied parrotfish and surgeonfish. So, okay. So if we look historically then at all of the data for coral cover in the Keys, what we find is that we began seeing the decline in the 1970s, okay, about 1% a year. In the 80s, it jumped to about 5% a year. This was Key Largo data. This was Lou Key, Jim Porter's work. Again, we were seeing increased water coming south, both due to extreme rainfall in the early 80s and water management as well. But here we go, the big jump, Keys wide, 10% rate of coral loss per year between 1996 and 2000. And this particular reef at the rock pile, you can see, it was directly in the trajectory, the plume of Shark River. It is no longer with us. So what we have today, if you go to Lou Key or most of the reefs in the Keys, these are algal-dominated reefs. Algal turf, these small algae, are about 50% of the bottom. The crustose coralline algae are about 15%, and the macroalgae are about 20%. And this is our phase shift, kind of shifting baseline model with increasing nutrients here, how the relative abundance of corals goes down as it is replaced by turf algae, macroalgae, and the CCA. And of course, the cartoonists had a lot of fun with this. This is dated 1998, as we saw what was unfolding with the Water Quality Protection Program. So, economic crisis in the Keys, beaches getting shut down, and the dive industry, of course, having a hard time selling dirty water and dying coral reefs. So we've seen a greater interest in sinking artificial reefs, ships. And of course, this is interesting going back to Louis Agassiz, right? That we want to get rid of the coral to save the ships, and now we're sinking the ships to save the economy. And of course, the most recent of those is the Vandenberg that was sunk off Key West in 2009. So this was all reviewed in 2002 by the Committee on Restoration of the Greater Everglades Ecosystems. And these are just some of the conclusions I wanted to share with you from that report. And it's that an important assumption that's made by scientists, managers, and the public is that increased flows of water deemed necessary to restore habitats in the Everglades will also contribute to restoration of Florida Bay. For a number of reasons, these assumptions may not be correct. Evidence linking turtle grass die-off to hypersalinity is equivocal. Little agreement by scientists on this issue. The effects of SERP on Taylor Slough will have little effect on bay salinity, and effects of increased flow from Shark River Slough is uncertain because not a lot of that water gets into Florida Bay. Effects of increased flows on groundwater fluxes to Florida Bay are also not well known. But most importantly, the phytoplankton blooms in Florida Bay appear to develop where nitrogen-enriched water from land drainage mixes with relatively phosphorus-rich water in the central and western bay. And that increased freshwater fluxes could increase phytoplankton blooms in the bay. Obviously, that's written in the future tense. It had already happened. And this was the following year, the dead zone in Florida Bay officially recognized by the Pew Oceans Commission report 2003, based on a scientific paper by Bob Diaz from VIMS up on Chesapeake Bay. This is a bloom we've since seen in 2013. As I mentioned, we had a very wet year that year, record rainfall in the summer. Also, the completion of the C-111 Western project designed to deliver more water to the Central Bay via Taylor Slough. And this is almost identical to the blooms we saw in the early 90s when more water was added to the bay. And just like those early blooms, this resulted in a big sponge die-off. You can see how it came all the way down to the lower Florida Keys. And finally, I just want to close by sharing with you a short video about some of the positive things that are happening in the Florida Keys regarding the septic to sewer program that is just being completed. This was initiated in 1996, and like I said, it's just being completed today. My septic tank on Big Pine Key got hooked up about 4 months ago. We're already seeing amazing improvement in our canal, which was being affected by surface scums. Last year, we're already seeing actually recruitment of seagrasses into the canal. We lost virtually all our seagrasses. Yeah. Hi, I'm Dr. Brian Lapointe, research professor with Florida Atlantic University's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute. I've spent decades studying water issues throughout Florida, including nutrient pollution and harmful algal blooms. When it comes to securing Florida's future, few issues are as important as water. From the Florida Keys to the springs in North Florida, we find the issues are the same throughout the state. This project with the Florida Chamber of Commerce provides scientific insight as to how human activities are impacting Florida's water resources and why we must all work together to be part of the solution.
Here in the Florida Keys, we're not only an area of state critical concern, but we also touch important environmental boundaries. The Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, 3 other national parks, 5 state parks, 4 national wildlife refuges, and 3 aquatic preserves.
When I first moved to the Keys in '78, and then of course I was coming down before that as a kid in the mid-'60s diving, the waters were blue, it's clear. There are a lot of healthy corals. Today the water's more of a green, and the corals are, what few are left, are in pretty sad shape.
As the Keys became more popular and more people moved there, they installed septic systems that leached and leaked onto the reef. Many businesses had package plants that used shallow injection wells to inject into the porous substrata of the Keys, which essentially flushed it out to the reef with every tide.
The algae blooms in the last few years have really been getting worse. It starts off growing on the bottom and on fixed objects, and then it breaks loose and flows with the current and catches on our trap ropes. A line of traps that normally would take an hour to pull can sometimes take 3 or 4 hours, and it's a real economic problem.
In the mid-1990s to the early 2000s, we measured declines in live coral cover of about 40%, as well as declines in elkhorn coral of approximately 90%. And these declines in coral cover were correlated with changes in water quality that occurred in the Florida Keys during that time period. Other studies have shown that there were unprecedented algal blooms in the Florida Keys during that time.
There are probably as many economic considerations as there are environmental. I mean, I see real estate people now coming forward. I mean, it affects their ability to sell real estate. It affects a homeowner's property values. You know, that may be as important as in moving forward this whole idea for septic tank replacements as anything we've got going.
Local waters can certainly be improved with a central sewage system, and that's on its way. And it's pretty obvious. You go to housing developments where they're on some type of central sewage, and the canals are nice. And I think what we're doing here in the Florida Keys can be an example to these other places of what needs to be done.
Marathon ended up being the focus of a pilot program to determine how well this centralized sewage system we were building was going to work. We began to see statistically definable water quality improvements, and secondarily, as you began to look at the near shore, up to 500 feet offshore from this canal system that was a part of our island here, you actually began to see improvements in the seagrass beds.
The Cudjoe Regional Water Reclamation Facility is a 940,000 gallon a day advanced wastewater treatment plant. We're getting the nutrients down to at least 95% removal rate from the incoming flow.
It is of critical importance to the country that this is preserved because there's no place like it. It's the last of our real coral reefs, and so if there's something we can do that makes it better, like have sewers, I mean, it's really a no-brainer. I'm kind of key-centric. I care about this area. It's where I've been for many, many years. It's my community, and I care very deeply about it. But I also understand that it's an interconnected environment. So if it's bad up north and they choose to send it south, we're the ones that suffer. Now, like I say, I'm sympathetic, but I'm not so sympathetic that I want their water. I don't want to share their water. I want them to fix their water.
So this paper just came out last month in the journal Science on nitrogen pollution and how with climate change, simply due to the changes in precipitation alone, extreme rain events like we've been seeing, that the nitrogen loading from our planet's rivers to our coastal zone is going to increase by 20%. And that to offset that, we need to reduce nitrogen loads from a variety of sources by about 33%, which is going to be a huge challenge. And with that, I just want to thank a number of funding sources that have supported this work over many years, and thank you.
So we're just going to take a couple questions right now so we can go to lunch, and just so you know, Brian will be on the discussion panel, so you can ask, just write down your questions and we'll get them answered then.
At a sewage processing facility, how is nitrogen removed from the effluent?
From the wastewater effluent? Good question. And this goes back, I know, to a lot of concerns people have in these septic to sewer programs. It's removed by a biological nitrogen removal process called Bardenfo. And that plant you just saw in the video on Cudjoe Key is probably one of the most advanced plants in Florida. James Barden, the architect of the Bardenfo technology, actually was a consultant to the engineers that developed that system. And Ed, you may have some other information about it, but they're going to be able to get the nitrogen in the effluent down to below 1 milligram per liter, and that's happening in a number of plants around Florida today. That technology is really improving very quickly.
How much out-of-pocket expense did you have for converting from septic to sewage?
Another good question. I think the Florida Keys is a great model for what has to happen in other areas like the Indian River Lagoon that are having issues with septics. It was written right into actually the growth management plan, that, an agreement between Monroe County and the state on matching funds, okay, which really reduced the homeowner's cost, okay. It cost me $4,300 for the assessment, and I think another $1,800 for the actual abandonment of the septic tank and the hookup to the sewer. So I would have gladly paid that 34 years ago when I moved in, and I think it would have clearly had really beneficial effects in protecting the water quality around our neighborhood had we all been on this from the get-go. So I'm very comfortable with that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So on that, did they give the homeowners an option to spread the payments?
Yes, there were different options for homeowners to amortize that over longer periods of time. Yeah, there are a number of opportunities like that available.
Okay. You're going during the discussion period, because I know what you want.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, John, we've got one here. Yeah.
Does the technology exist to have advanced septic systems that reduces the amount of nutrients that come out of the outflow of the septic systems?
Yeah, the Department of Health actually has been funding research because obviously not everyone can hook up to a centralized sewer system like we're doing in the Florida Keys, yet are in critical watersheds like spring sheds. So in those cases, Department of Health and I believe Hazen and Sawyer have done research on these hybrid systems that are really advanced septic systems that include infrastructure in that system for nitrogen removal. And they're getting, I think, quite pricey compared to a conventional system. I'm not sure what those prices are. Ed, do you?
I can't give you a number, I don't remember, but I know it was one that they explored in the Wakulla Spring Shed.
Mm-hmm.
And it got well over, I want to say $10,000, $15,000 per system, so the communities just rejected it and decided that they would hook up. It would be a much cheaper, better alternative to hook up. So that it did come up in the Wakulla Spring Shed. That was several years ago. But yeah, I know Eric Livingston with the department did a lot of work on the advanced wastewater or the advanced septic systems, and it's still out there. It's still going. We'll see.
Yeah.